Lighting is perhaps the most important thing to understand in miniature painting. After all, without lighting, there is no scene. There's no miniature, there's no painting, there's just darkness. In this way, the lighting is what tells the story. So it's no wonder that OSL, or object source lighting, is a technique renowned by some of the best miniature painters in the world. It's a topic that I've been fascinated with for quite some time, but it's also a topic that I've struggled with a bit. But in my recent painting, I feel like there's something that has really clicked for me. And so in this video, I'll share these insights with you. And in the process, I'll be painting Berserk from Nordlys, which is sculpted by my friend Torben Rydel, which I'll talk more about later. And before we start, I want to remind you that there's a 1-hour extended edit of this video available to my patrons over on Patreon. So if you're interested in the deep dive, go ahead and check that out through the link in the description. For now, let's get started. And as you know, I like to start with a bit of theory before picking up the brush and going to the model. So let's talk a little bit about what OSL is and how it works. Object source lighting is basically just lighting that is coming from an object. It could be an object that is in the scene or something that is out of the scene. So if the character is holding a torch, we might want to paint the lighting coming from the torch as something that affects the entire model. In this case, the source of the lighting, the torch, would be in the scene. The other OSL scenario is that the lighting is off screen, which means that the character could be standing under a street light or sitting by a bonfire that is not in the miniature itself. In this scenario, the light source is off screen. So I like to think of it like this. OSL makes the lighting, something that we otherwise take for granted in the story, into a character. Meaning that instead of the light surrounding and illuminating the character all around, the light exists instead in a distinct, limited space. And oftentimes will have a more distinct personality. The lighting from a torch, for instance, would have a very different temperature than the ambient lighting of a daytime setting. The torch light is much warmer, everything it hits thus will be pulled more towards orange. If we want to paint this, we have to use more orange paint. Which, by the way, I finally found an orange paint that doesn't suck. I know. Thank you. No, I can't. You're too kind. No, really, I can't accept that. It's this one. It's the Schmincke Pro Acryl Cadmium Orange. Go try it out and come back and tell me that this isn't the best orange paint you've ever tried. Painting OSL also makes us think more about the color of the light, less so than the color of the individual object that the light is hitting. This can help to create coherence and ambience in the piece. Again, with torchlight, everything would become some type of orange. So how do we really make this work? Let's have a look at 3 simple rules. Rule number 1. If the source of the lighting is in the scene and is supposed to be the dominant lighting of the whole scene, it should be the brightest spot in the whole miniature. Think of your painting as a camera. If you try to take a picture of a bonfire at nighttime where you have the bonfire in front and the stars of the night sky in the back, you have to adjust the exposure of the photo in order to match the strongest light there is. In this case, the bonfire. If you were to adjust the camera in such a way that you could also see the stars, the bonfire would be so screamingly bright and white that the photo would be ruined. So we have to choose, do we want to take a picture of the stars or do we want to take a picture of the bonfire? If we put them both into the same image, it's not going to work. Of course, there are camera technical ways of getting around this, such as taking 2 different photos and combining them, but the lesson I'm trying to convey here is really simple. We have to adjust our exposure to the brightest point in the scene, being the light source that is casting the OSL. For the light source to read as a light in your scene, it has to be the brightest point, or at least it has to be the brightest point in one viewing angle. Rule number 2. The darker the ambience, the more impactful the OSL. If you want to have your OSL stand out and be something special, it really helps to have those strong shadows surrounding it. Stronger shadows is going to help communicate the fact that this is a light source and not just brighter colors that are placed in one area of the miniature. Again, if we're thinking about the torchlight example, lighting a torchlight in broad daylight doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't affect much and it's not very dramatic, because we're not going to see it because of the brightness of the atmosphere. But doing it at night makes for an interesting lighting scenario. So just as you can think about the light as a character in the story you're trying to tell, you can also think about the shadows in this way. Try to darken everything that is outside the area of the OSL. Rule number 3. OSL works much better in pictures. OSL is really one of those techniques that shines in the photo studio, and especially on a black background. Again, something about those darker values really just helps to sell the effect. Try to evaluate your OSL on a dark background, and preferably on a photo. So, with these 3 simple rules in place, let's get started with the painting. In this first step, the object is really to paint in the shadow color. So here I'm using some blue-black mixture, and this is going to be the base tone for the shadows. The blue is going to contrast nicely with the color from the flame that we will have from the front. And here I'm just mixing some different variations of the skin tone using some blue and some orange to create this deeper brown color. And when we add the white, we're going to see that we get something like a skin tone. I'm also already thinking about the color of the light coming from the fire that will be in front. And here we really have to add those additions of orange I was talking about. So the lighting should be warmer and push everything more towards orange and yellow. So I start with working on the face and getting in some of the facial features and the skin tone on the face region. So it's a bit of a balance to strike, still have the volumetric lighting that shows kind of the volumes of the face that we're used to doing when we're working with the zenithal lighting, but at the same time having that underlight coming from the fire in front. We'll come back and refine the skin much more later, but for now the sketch is in place. From there I worked on to try to paint in some of the warmer lights. Starting on the lower part of the body with the legs and the feet and the hip area. Kind of finding some of the edges of all of these tiny materials almost in like a dry brushing sort of way, in that we're using much more the side of the brush than we're using the tip. It's going to be helpful to pick out all of the raised edges and all of the details that kind of protrude out from the shape. So once the shadow color is in place, we can push more of the orange light, especially on the higher parts of the figure, such as the beard and the face area. And here I'm really just experimenting, trying to push the light, seeing how far it should stretch on the different surfaces. So we can think about the leg as as sort of a cylinder shape, and in this case just pushing how far do we want it to stretch across that cylinder. These decisions are impacted by the strength of the light, but also the diffusion of it. So if we have a strong, very diffuse light, it should stretch quite far, but if we have something that's more localized and not as strong, then it will show up on a smaller surface on the model. And similarly, we're trying to stretch it down the other leg to see if it should cover a larger area of the boot. So as you can tell, this video is a bit more slow-paced. I got this idea from talking to one of my patrons. They wanted to see kind of a more brushstroke by brushstroke type of video where we got to see more of the actual real-time painting footage. And though this footage is sped up slightly, I've tried to, in this video, really include much more of the actual painting and skip less footage in the process. So this makes the video perhaps a little bit slower, but it's also a more realistic view into how I paint and how long it really takes for some of these effects to work. It's sort of an experiment to try to see if we can use more footage, but I hope you'll like it, or at least let me know what you think about it. So do leave a comment if you want to see more of the usual paced videos where we kind of skip through these initial sketching stages much more, or if you like the sort of honest videos that take a bit longer and also has sort of included more footage. So as you can tell right now, the face is super bright, and it doesn't necessarily fall in line with the lighting scenario though that we've painted on the rest of the character. Okay, so from here we're going to step in and try to sketch in some of the volumetric lighting, or some of the lighting coming from above. This is all just done with the same sort of bluish gray. This is Again, thinking less about local color and thinking more about the ambience and the environment. And if this is sort of a nighttime scene, everything would be pulled more towards gray with the dim light coming from the moon and the stars above. Okay, so from here we're starting to add some color to the materials. Here we're painting over the gray sketch. We can start to add in different transparent layers in order to give more color. So you can see that the leather is going to have some of this Van Dyke brown. It has a little bit of white and yellow mixed into it, but this can kind of ends up becoming quite a important color in the composition, as much of this top part of the figure will have different mixes of Van Dyke brown, and since the leather plays such a big role in this sculpt, then the Van Dyke brown really becomes quite a key color in the composition that kind of bridges the lighter values in top and binds them with the colder ambience and builds a bridge between the orange that we have from the bottom and the blue ambience in the top of the figure. You can also glaze over this with some of the shadow color if we find it too bright. And there's of course also some dark lining to be done in order to create the separation between different elements. So, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this miniature is sculpted by my friend Torben Rydel. I really like it because of the dynamic pose and the dramatic action that the character has. Torben hand sculpted all of this, and as much as you might get tired of painting these million leather straps, you really have to appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into making such a miniature. The kit is produced and sold by Nordlys Miniatures, and I'm delighted to tell you that Torben also recently won Best of Figure, which means that his sculpt was judged as the best sculpt in the entire competition at this year's Monte Sansevino. This award is incredibly prestigious and well deserved in my opinion. I'm also delighted to say that I'm working with Torben to produce and sell his piece on Kickstarter. I'll be posting more about this soon, so be sure to follow me on my socials. For now, let's get back to Berserk. From here we can move on to kind of paint some of the leather on the plates, the armor plates, and painting some more color on the leather on the other different elements that we're working with here. So the edges of these trims should have some highlight, and the overall shape should have that strand of light stretching across it, that brightest highlight from the reflection that points to the sky. And again, just working with different glazes and not really in too opaque layers here, but more of a tinting of the color. As we've done that, we've lost a little bit of the separation between the NMM and the leather. And we can then work with adding in stronger highlights and possibly black lining around the metal parts as well. And edge highlights, of course, are always important to make the metal stand out. Glazing in some shadow in the bottom of the element. So when we zoom out and get kind of this view, we're starting to see that the top view is starting to work. It has sort of this very kind of Skyrim-esque aesthetic that I quite like in the leather. Everything is sort of these tones of Van Dyke brown and darker blue, quite desaturated. And then we have the strong orange lighting that when we see it from the front and not from the top, we can really see the contrast between the different parts of the miniature. And so the challenge from here on then becomes to make sure that the lighting from above is not too strong in order to leave enough darkness for the OSL to really shine. Again, thinking back to the rules I was talking about at the beginning of the video, This is kind of the balance that I was really struggling with and put a lot of work into finding in this piece. So a lot of back and forth in order to kind of land at the sweet spot where both lighting sources, both sources of light are coming to their own, but at the same time the OSL should really be the main topic of the paint job and the story here. So it's tricky because we do need some very bright reflections on the NMM for the NMM to work, but we also need strong shadows for it to separate from the OSL lighting. So I'm kind of painting with two different viewing angles in mind. One is from behind and from the top, where we see more of the ambient light, and one is in the front where we see more of the OSL. And all of this metal work that you'll see me do right now is all something that I'll come back in and glaze down a little bit just to dim it ever so slightly in the end. But still, I think working in the midtones, such as what we're doing here, is really a good investment for the NMM. It is something that you do have to work with either way. I also want to take this moment to say thanks to all of my patrons. I really appreciate the support you're giving me over on Patreon, and I hope to see you there as well. Either for some private coaching, or maybe you just want to see the extended versions of the videos that I'm posting here, as well as the occasional PDF tutorial. At this point, I think that the kind of overhead ambience feels much more like a daytime scenario than it does a nighttime, which is really too bad, I think. So I'll come back with the airbrush in a little bit and try to darken everything. You can see me starting to do it with the brush here as well, just to lower some of the values a little bit. And here we're going back in and painting some of the axe more detailed. We will end up changing some things in this painting, but I really just want to show you how many iterations and different variables I go through when I try to do a painting like this. It's not unusual for me to paint the same material multiple times and doing some of these tiny adjustments. So here I'm thinking that we need more darkness in the NMM, but really I think what we need is much more a main and a secondary reflection. So we'll come back in and do that in a little bit. But the refinement process like this one can really stretch on for quite a while, and it's something that you could spend months on, just doing these small incremental changes and make small individual elements look more convincingly on their own, and in time it'll add up to a better paint job overall. And you really have to listen to your gut here. If this is something you enjoy doing, some people are perfectionists and like spending a long time on the details, or maybe if you're painting for a competition, you might want to extend this step quite a bit. For me, this is more of a creative space, so it really is a balance and depends on the piece for me. So sometimes I'll spend a long time with the details, especially if I'm painting for someone else, if it's a commission or a box art or something. But with this one, I kind of just wanted to make something that was a study in OSL, and so the NMM work becomes a little bit secondary, but I think it should still be to a standard where it is not detrimental to the rest of the paint job. So perhaps I do have a bit of that perfectionism in me as well. I think probably most miniature painters has. Glazing some of the flatter areas of the axe here. Again, we can make some contrast between the curved edges and the flat edges by having the flat edges be more dim and having the curves have the main highlight. But the kind of reflection on the side of the blade should extend from the curvature onto the flat surfaces, just as how we're looking at it from here. And again, I think if we were in a daytime scenario, looking at this now, I do think that this NMM would be absolutely fine. But since we're trying to convey that darker ambience, we do have to dim everything down a bit. And it's something that I'll be doing a little bit later with the airbrush and glazing some of the top of the miniature. And so here we're messing up all of the fine work we just did on the X and adding in the secondary reflection instead. Working back and forth with sort of the same palette on the different metals, trying just to get the contrast in place. So one plate can be brighter and one plate can be darker, just as I talked about earlier. And paying some attention to the orange reflection that will be on the bottom there of the sword. It's a nice way to show sort of where the lighting from the fire is. Some specular highlights of bright orange yellow down here on the bottom. Again, especially on the shiny materials. The OSL is starting to work. We can really see when we look at the model from different angles here. So you can tell that I'm jumping a bit between different elements of the model at any given point. This is just how I like to paint. So at this point I did a bit of airbrush glazing, some transparent ultramarine blue and black from the top, and some transparent lasur orange from the bottom. I think this really helped to tie in the different ambiances of the miniature a little bit more. And then I called him done. There he is. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you've learned a thing or two about object source lighting. If you like what I do, I hope you'll consider checking out the Patreon, where you'll find longer edits of all of my videos, or maybe even signing up for some private coaching. You can also support me by checking out some of my socials, which are linked in the description. And lastly, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and happy painting.